Shalom TV's coverage of the 10th anniversary Limmud conference is made possible in part by a grant from Dr. Naomi Vilko, in honor of her mother, Olga Vilko, and in memory of her father, William Vilko.
A couple of years ago, I was privileged to be part of a think tank, the subject of which was, will Jewish civilization survive the year 2025? Nishmer Nishveinike. That's a simple topic. There were 10 Israelis, 10 American Jews, and there were some scholars. And what the scholars presented was a distillation of history, trying to find what it is that kept the Jewish civilization alive and going, and what it was that other civilizations, such as the Roman and the Inca, why they perished. And what they distilled for us to struggle with was the concept that in all these other societies, all these civilizations, the Roman, the Greek, you name them, there came a time in that empire, in that civilization's history, where they had a defeat, they had a trauma. And after that defeat and trauma, the Romans, the Greeks, the Incas, whoever it is, got up in the morning, brushed themselves off, and said, we no longer want to be Romans. We no longer want to be Greeks. We no longer want to be what it was, the civilization that we were part of. And the one thing that differentiated the Jewish civilization was that after every trauma, every tragedy, the Jewish community would get up in the morning, brush itself off, and say, we want to continue to be Jewish. And the greatest miracle in terms of this phenomenon was after the Shoah. For the Jewish people, after the Shoah, after that tragedy, after that trauma, to get up and say, we want to continue to be Jews, then to go on and to build the Jewish state, etc., that's the secret of Jewish survival, that's the secret of Jewish civilization, etc., etc. And for us, was posed the question, so now, when things are very good and we don't have traumas, the opposite is true. Will the Jews get up every morning and say, I want to continue to be Jewish? And that, when you talk about issues facing the Jewish community, I would say to you that that's a very, very serious, significant question in terms of now, for the first time, the freedoms that we have, the openness that there is. Most of us do not see or experience persecution, discrimination, trauma, etc. The second thing I want to just share with you is in the business that I'm in. I'm frequently asked the question, what is it that keeps you up at night? And that has changed throughout the years. I would say 30 years ago, if you asked that question, it would be Israel's neighborhood. The then uncertainty, the then enmity. Today you have instability, but the enmity then was something that all of us who cared about the Jewish future, Jewish continuity, etc. So it was that's surrounding. 15 years ago, if you remember, was the outbreak of new anti-Semitism, as we call new anti-Semitism, in Europe, globally. To those of us following, it's not new, it was old and new. The old hasn't stopped, the new is part of the old, etc. But that became a very, very serious issue. Not that it's gone away, it probably has gotten worse. But I would say today, If you say to me, what is it that keeps you up at night? It's, in one sentence, Israel's dependence on the United States of America. It doesn't sound very troubling or traumatic. I had the privilege of getting to know Arik Sharon on a personal basis. And when he became prime minister, I got a call, "Nu, where are you? Now I'm prime minister, where are you?" So I came, and we sat. We sat around a table and we schmoozed, and he said to me, "You have any advice for me?" I said, "Not really." And then I thought about it, and I said, "Yeah, one piece of advice. I don't know, those of you who follow Israel and its leaders closely, Arik Sharon, after Glasnost and Perestroika, went to the former Soviet Union in an effort to see if he can convince the new rulers of Russia, of the Soviet Union, whether they would consider becoming strong allies of the State of Israel. In effect, trying to develop an alternative to the United States. And so I said to him, the Prime Minister kept saying, "Arik," I said, "the one thing you need to do is convince the Americans that you really weren't serious about trying to replace the alliance between Israel and the United States with a new alliance between Russia and Israel." And he looked at me and he said, "You know, Abe, Israel's security depends on two pillars, Tzva Hagana L'Yisrael and the United States of America." And then he chuckled and he said, "And you know, even the first depends on the second." And if you just let that sink in and you take a look globally, you take a look at the world as it is, with its cynicism, with its hypocrisy, with its interest, with its lack of interest, with its lack of morality. Okay, today there's Canada. I have to remember, my wife reminds me, she's Canadian, there's Canada. And the Prime Minister of Canada was just in Israel, and he said, with blood and with fire, we'll be there. Okay, all right. There's also the Marshall Islands and Papua. There are a couple of others. But the truth is, with the world the way it is today, the only place in the world that Israel needs is the United States of America. And so why does it keep me up at night? Hey, you know, it's been pretty good. In all these years, the relationship has been pretty good. Although there's some of us in this room remember that there was a time when America didn't sell arms to Israel. There was a time that the United States sanctioned, and you know what? Forget about Democrats and Republicans. This is a new Bubba Meiser. Okay, and don't get too comfortable, because Republicans were on this side and on that side, and Democrats were on this side and on that side, and it all depended on a perception of interest. And here too, you know, we always say there's interest, there's common interest. There is and there may not be. There is and there may not be. I just had an opportunity to sit to listen to Ari Shavit at the end of his presentation. And Ari talked about not the military interest, not the strategic interest, which also in a moment I'll get to, is changing. But the thing that buttresses a relationship, which is the moral, the positive, the image, et cetera, and that is changing. The reality that I see every day is that the only country in the world that has stood with Israel, that still stands with Israel, is the United States of America. And that's both a blessing and a curse. And now what we're finding ourselves is a situation where our national security interest may diverge. And there's a debate here. Is this president this? Is the president? Take away how you feel about him. Take away political labels. The United States of America today is moving isolationist. It's both Democrats and Republicans who are moving isolationist. America has always been, not only on the issue of Israel, but on issue of safety, security, well-being of the Jews throughout the world, the only place, the most significant place, that intervened. If you think we would have obtained Soviet Jewry's freedom without Jackson Vanik, without the United States, without a Schultz having a Seder of refuseniks in Moscow, if you think we would have seen Ethiopian Jews free, Syrian Jews free, without the role of an American government that saw as part of its mission, part of its morality, part of its being, an embrace of the Jewish people and to stand up. And it still is the only country in the world that mandates a fight against anti-Semitism to all its ambassadors. It's the only country in the world where there's an envoy whose responsibility it is to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. Every ambassador in the world, the United States ambassador, is required to submit reports on anti-Semitism and what we're doing about it. So it's still the anomaly out there. But if this country all of a sudden turns inward, if this country in its perception of what it perceives to be its national interest turns inward, it will impact not only on the relationship between the State of Israel, but certainly on the ability and the role of the Jewish community and the United States to act and stand on behalf of Jews when they are in trouble. And that's enough to keep me up at night, if nothing else does. It is something we need to be concerned about. We need to be concerned how we challenge, how we address U.S. government in disagreement. We need to take a very serious cheshbon hanefesh. I just came from Florida, you can tell. Okay? The loose talk in the Jewish community about this administration and this president is scary. Is scary. I've heard things expressed which I never thought I would hear. And the fact is, whether you like him or not, whether you like the party or not, the fact is that this president is articulating what he believes to be in the best interest of the United States. Believe me, he doesn't get up in the morning to say, how can I hurt Israel or how can I help Israel? He gets up in the morning to, in his best knowledge, whatever, to articulate, to plan, to move what he believes is in the best. And today, what he believes is in the best interest of the United States is to keep us out of war. Okay? And he's not alone. Now, that decision has implications for Israel and our relationship with Israel. But it's not because he likes Israel or hates Israel, and this is what I've heard. And it's irresponsible. A, because there's another 3 years, very serious 3 years. And this is something that I think we need to give ourselves all the time a cheshbon hanefesh in terms of how we perceive it, how we criticize it, and what it means. There are serious differences. There are serious differences. Okay? Now, I criticized Kerry, but I was one of the first ones to jump down somebody's throat in Israel who called him an anti-Semite because you disagree with him. So we have to be very, very careful with how we express our differences and our challenges, etc. Okay, the floor is yours.
So there are countries now in Europe that are becoming much more anti-Semitic. Is there anything that Israel can do, or the Jewish community here in the United States, that will impact that trajectory? Because it seems like it has taken on a life of its own.
It has taken on a life of its own. What we can do is what we've done in the past, but let me first explain what you're saying. There is today a growing phenomenon in Europe of nationalist, neo-fascist, neo-Nazi, anti-immigrant parties. All of them come to have a cement, have a glue, which is anti-Semitism. The irony is that today, all these groups, all these political entities are against a unified Europe. They're all opposed to the EU. And yet, they're all fielding candidates this June for the European Parliament. This is a tactic and a strategy to try to establish their strength, a unified strength across Europe, to show how potent, how vibrant, how vigorous they are. The added problem is that we're having difficulty convincing the nationalist countries, Ukraine, Greece, Hungary, etc., Bulgaria, not to include them at this stage in their government coalitions. The political system in Europe is so fractured today that in many of these countries, these political parties are part of the coalition because they can make a difference as to who governs and who does not. And so even a Bulgaria, which has a magnificent history, at least in the Shoah, today, you talk to the head of state, the prime minister, which we talk to, and the president, and they all say, we need them, don't worry, but we need them for our coalition. And so the question to you is, what do we need to do? We need to watch it very carefully. We need to reach out. They reach out to us. They do understand they also need America in the future. They need it in relationship. We need to make sure that the American government continues to make an issue that it's democracy that we're concerned about, and part of democracy is how they treat minorities. And you also have a very interesting sideline there. The whole issue of shechita. Shechita is directed more against Muslims than it against Jews. Shechita is ritual slaughter. There is a movement in Europe growing to to ban ritual slaughter. Now, in Poland, for example, it's made the news. The issue in Poland, it impacts on the Jewish community and kosher slaughter. But the issue is Muslims. There's a major industry of slaughtering halal, which is Islamic ritual slaughter, shechita, to export. And so the good news out of this bad news, I met with the Polish ambassador and said, I don't understand why the Jews are so upset. I said, you don't understand? Basically, what you're saying to the small community of Jews in Poland, that you really want Poland to be Judenrein. Because if you're opposed to kosher slaughter and say places opposed to circumcision, which also the Muslims are engaged in, they're talking about the Muslims, but it's impacting on the Jews. So the irony of all ironies, the Muslims and the Jews in Europe are not brothers or cousins, as we would like them to be. But the issue of shechita and circumcision is bringing them together. Even the hijaz, even the religious clothing brought them together in France because it also impacted on a kippah. So the irony is, here they're apart, and yet on certain issues they've come together. What we can do is keep the light on it. What we can do is make sure that they know that we're watching, that it matters, it makes a difference, and there will be consequences. Look, when it comes to anti-Semitism, and people have said to me, what's the difference between the U.S. and the rest of the world when it comes to anti-Semitism? Number one, we're not immune. America is not immune. We have anti-Semitism. But not in the numbers that it's out there globally. And today in the world, it's growing. So what's the difference? In Europe, you even have legislation. We don't have legislation in this country to prohibit racism or anti-Semitism. Most European countries have legislation. You can't do Holocaust denial, you can't engage in racism or anti-Semitism, and yet we don't have the laws and it's low, they have the laws and it's high, for us. It's not an exact science, but what we've learned to understand is, in this country, the social value system is basically the Constitution gives you the right, protects your right to be a bigot. But if you're a bigot, you pay a price. There is a consequence to your being a bigot. In Europe, it's not certainly not in the Arab world. Lahafech. There, it's a plus. But in many places in Europe, it's politically expedient to be an anti-Semite. Now again, in our country, it's not perfect. To me, Mel Gibson is a perfect example of how our system works. Mel Gibson was the #1, he was People's Choice actor, director, producer, till he revealed himself as a bigot and anti-Semite. And we don't have legislation. He's not in prison. He's not paying fines. But our system rejected him. He paid a price because it's not acceptable. In Europe, you don't have it. You don't have it. And that's the basic difference here. You can start as a politician. We've had our McKinneys. But they didn't make it for long. So that's the difference, basically. How we get it in Europe, how we get that standard up, how we make it so that it matters what the spokesmen say. Still, the most significant response to European anti-Semitism is to get the heads of state, the Minister of Education, the Minister of Interior, the Minister of Justice, the Prime Minister, the President, to condemn it. They're good at that. But implementing and going after them and punishing them is another system. But at this point, to get them to condemn it is about as much as you can expect and hope for.
What impact might an economic boycott in Europe have on Israel, and can it take hold here?
An economic boycott in Europe on Israel can significantly hurt Israel. The major trading partner of Israel today is Europe. So it can significantly hurt. Look, I'm old enough. I've been in professional Jewish life a long time. I go back 40 years ago when we fought the boycott in the United States. It was the Arab boycott. Then it didn't deal with occupation and settlements, okay? It's what Ari Shavit reminds us. It has nothing to do with, the attack was on the state of Israel. And the Arab boycott, there was an Arab boycott office in Damascus, and it worked well by frightening people. I mean, American businesses took the easy way out. They looked on a piece of paper, 1 billion versus a couple of million, and they said, what do they need? What do they need this for? And the trade that wasn't happening, the investments that weren't happening, were because why bother? Why get yourself into? We believe, now, you had an interesting thing, the Israelis didn't want to talk about it. Because the Israelis felt the more you talk about it, the more you give it credibility, you let people know, most people don't know, we didn't have the internet, okay. We took an opposite direction, because what was happening is it was impacting on American Jews in business. Because the boycott forums were not only do you do business with us, are you Jewish, et cetera, et cetera. It took us 10 years in this country to develop anti-boycott legislation, which basically was a shield for the American businessman who would say to whatever Arab country asked him, sent them forms saying, listen, I'd like to cooperate with you, but here's American legislation. I don't want to break America's laws. And it broke the back, and little by little, and now you have the situation that you have. But Europe can hurt. You ask about here. I am still of the opinion, at this point, a personal opinion, that BDS won't take a hold here. Because that's not our tradition. You saw the last ASA. You saw it backfired. It was a stimulus for 180, 200 colleges, universities to reject it. There is now some legislation pending in Congress to punish. I don't think it's the best way to go. I think the best, in the United States, you don't punish academic institutions, even if it's in behalf of Israel. You want to help Israel, don't engage in boycotting and punishing academic institutions. I would take that legislation and turn it around and say incentives. That means rather than punish, incentivize those universities and colleges that reach out and have programs, give them more funding, et cetera, rather than punitive. I still don't think it will take here. But, you know, part of that nightmare, part of that thing is, and I guess I'm still haunted by that column in the Times this weekend, is in Europe, and go back to America, in Europe, the public is not with Israel. Okay? The public is not with Israel. The media is not with Israel. The public is not with Israel. It's not with Israel. And when you take polls, just generically, it's like 3-1 pro-Palestinian. Okay? Here it's reversed. Here it's 3-1, 4-1 pro-Israel. If we lose the public here, God forbid, if we lose the public, then all kinds of things, then boycotts are legitimate and it will be okay. And I'm going to say something to what extent the public goes depends where the Jewish community goes. Okay? Now, we are accused of being all-powerful and we control everything. We don't control everything. Halavai, we controlled everything. Halavai, we controlled the media. Okay. Halavai, we controlled Hollywood. You wouldn't have 5 or 8 movies in 25 years that are. But the one thing we do control is how we feel about that which is dear to us. And if, now, I got to go back to Ari Shavit, who came back from, he's been out there 2-3 weeks on the campuses. And the report is not a good one. Our young people, most of it was ignorance. Right? I think that part of the problem with a younger generation is we never taught them. We finished their Jewish education at the age of 12 and 13. They were finished being Jews. For 5 years as they became adolescents, Judaism was something they're finished with. Then they got on a college campus. Oy vey, they're not running to Hillel. Why should they run to Hillel? They finished being Jews with their bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah. Okay, it's changing because of birthright, etc. But if the American Jewish community does not embrace and support Israel, not right and wrong. If a Jew can say, I love Judaism and hate the state of Israel, whoa, that's a signal, that's a message which will reverberate to the non-Jewish community. Say, if the Jews don't care, I tell you, when Hillary ran for the Senate of the U.S., somebody invited 10 of us for dinner with Hillary. And she didn't understand why the Jews were so upset at her. And we said to her, look, when you were the first lady and you tried to be even-handed and balanced, okay. But when you run for the Senate in New York and you're not 110% for Israel, you're going to be in trouble. In the same way that a senator from Nebraska has to be 110% pro-farm policy. For us, because the senator of Nebraska is going to look at the senator of New York, how they vote on an issue and how they articulate on an issue of Israel, in the same way that if you, Madam whatever, becomes senator, you're going to look to see what the senator of Nebraska is doing on such and such legislation. In the same way, the non-Jewish world is looking very closely how and where the Jewish community is on Israel. And again, I'm not saying to you right or wrong. I'm not saying you can't criticize, but it is a very important ingredient of what may or may not be. And if you're worried about boycott, if they feel that the Jewish neighbors don't care, one more element that we learned in the last election. You remember the last election, there was a lot of brouhaha about Israel. And some in the political arena were trying to make Israel as an issue. And so the pollsters in this country said, oh, they wanted to be able to project. And what they found, they asked the question, where is Israel on your scale of priorities when you vote? And 4 to 5% of the American Jewish community said, Israel's number one when I vote. Okay? Well, that's fine. But then, there are other issues when they vote. But that's a very important statistic to remember in terms of how what we say is interpreted.
You speak of Europe as though it's a unified country. When we talk about Israel, the one country in Europe that I wonder about is Germany, which I think has shown, for obvious reasons of guilt and whatever, a very great, and I would go so far as to say aggressive friendship towards Israel over the years. Will that continue in your opinion? And if so, will it make a difference?
Germany still is the most anti-Semitism country in the world. Germany is a country that educated towards democracy, which from our point of view was, how can people do it? And yet it did. It did it well. And to this day, there is anti-Semitism, but there are more institutes, more books, more dealing with anti-Semitism, etc. Having said that, they're getting tired. They're getting tired of carrying the guilt for another generation, another generation, and another generation. I remember the first time I went to Germany, we visited Wehrmacht University, which is Wehrmacht is their military, it's their West Point without uniform. I think now they're in uniform. And I remember we sat around the room, and one of the cadets said to me, Herr Foxman, it's over. I looked at him and I said, I understand how much you want the past to be over, but it's not over. It's not over for me, so it's not over for you. If it's not over for me, it's not going to be over for my children. And chances are it will not be over for their children, so it's not over. But we need to appreciate how much they want this to be over. So part of this guilt relates to Israel, and they're not comfortable with it. Germany is a staunch ally, but Merkel doesn't hesitate to chastise Israel on settlements in a loud voice. Again, I don't think we should sit back and believe it's going to be there forever. Ironically, the staunchest friends of Israel in Europe today are many of the former Soviet Union countries. So Germany held the fort, but today you look at the EU, the stronger countries in terms of Israel are those that historically were not our friends. And I remember I was invited once to a luncheon with the Lithuanians and the ambassadors of Lithuania and Latvia and Ukraine, etc. And I looked up and I said, Tatashi, do you see who's hosting me? Yeah.
With regard to the peace process and the fact that the Palestinians basically do not acknowledge Israel's existence, and more to the point, probably want to push them into the sea, What is your perspective on how that's going and if there's any ultimate solution?
I'm an optimist. If you know my life's history, you'll know, having survived the Shoah as a child, over 1.5 million children perished, I don't have the right to be a pessimist. So everything in life, I'm an optimist. And I also remember Golda Meir said Jews don't have the luxury to be pessimists. So I'm an optimist, even about peace. It's how you define peace. It's not the peace that we know between Canada and the US and Mexico or Benelux. But I believe that it's possible. It's possible. But again, not in the sense that you and I would like to see it. You know what? We don't have it today between Egypt and Israel. We don't have it between Jordan and Israel. And yet it's a situation where we can live, with the Israelis can live, etc. So, and they too, the incitement there was horrific. Okay? It took different leadership. So I do believe, listen, I watch Israeli television, which my wife says to me, don't. It's enough, you know, anyway. So I watched two things. I watched the burial of the terrorists, of murderers in Ramallah. I watched the military funerals. I watched the covet, the dignity they're giving them. I watched on television at 3 o'clock in the morning Abu Mazen running to receive the murderers. They're not prisoners of war, murderers of men, women, and children. And I say to myself, it will never happen. It will never happen. Because you know what? He could have sent a message. He could have sent a third secretary. At the funerals, they could have been, okay. So on one hand, I say, Rebbeinu Shalom. But then you know what? A couple of months ago, I had a meeting with one of the Palestinians in Ramallah. And again, my wife said, Wo kriegst du? 10 o'clock at night, where are you going? I got into a car at 10 o'clock at night. We went to Ramallah. We crossed the Israeli checkpoint, the Palestinian checkpoint, sat for 2 hours, argued, debated, got into the car, came in. You know what? That's a change. There was a time where the only way I would go to Ramallah was with the U.S. consul or with an American. I also see, it happened a year ago, an Israeli soldier got lost. How he got lost, but he got lost and wound up in the center of Ramallah. And this time a policeman approached the car, and when a mob was forming, he took his pistol, shot in the air, and he says, the next person that gets closer to this car, I will shoot. He got into the car and escorted the Israeli soldier out. To me, that's changed. Yes, I just read on Ynet, Abu Mazen invited 300 Israelis, students, to Ramallah. Now, my question is that only playing for Ynet, or what he said to them, they also play on Ramallah TV? But there is change. But don't expect the type of peace. I think it's possible to come to a modus vivendi. And that's, you know what? And that's what Kerry is all about. I can be angry at Kerry. You can be angry at Kerry. But you know what? Kerry has institutionalized for America two things which the Americans poo-pooed in their efforts to bring peace. One is the Jewish state. If you remember, Jewish state is Bibi's excuse not to make peace. Kerry finally understands the significance to Israel, to the possibility of peace, and the United States has taken that as part of the essential. Number two is security in the West Bank. Again, this was, Bibi, the Israelis, they don't want, etc. America has now incorporated it as a core condition. So I don't like it when he threatens Israel with boycott, and he threatened Israel with boycott. But on the other hand, you know what? There's nobody else who can do it. Nobody else but America. So I am optimistic that we may get somewhat closer.
The new Pope and the relationship of American Jews and Israel and the Catholic Church. Your comments.
Again, history, the irony of history. The Catholic Church was the greatest enemy of the Jewish people. Today, if you're to look at religious movements, the Catholic Church is today, I would say, probably the best friend of the Jewish people. How did it happen? It happened with the influence of a pope most of us don't know very much about, John the 23rd, who wasn't there for a long time, but the more we learn about him, the role that he played during the Shoah as Cardinal of Paris, even after the war, the role that he played in returning Jewish children, etc. He was a significant influence in bringing about Vatican II. Then came Vatican II, which forgave simplistically the Jews for the crucifixion of Christ, but then it needed the charisma, the imprimatur of a pope. And John Paul came on the scene. And John Paul didn't change history, but changed the relationship in such a manner that he even changed dogma in the church vis-a-vis the Jews. Christian theology was that the covenant between God and Jesus replaced the covenant between God and Abraham. That we were no longer relevant. And if we're not relevant, then we don't have a path to God and salvation. So then you have your Inquisition. Either you convert or you don't have the right to live, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You write the history. Comes John Paul and changes dogma. Basically saying to the Christian world, Jews have a viability of their own way to salvation. They're our older brothers, etc. And the most important thing that he did was to go to synagogue. I'll tell you a maisele. I have friends in Rome who live in the Jewish quarter. They have 2 stores there. The square is called Limantani Square. They're Limantanis. They go back to the 15th century. In Italy, they were given permission by the Pope in the 15th century to produce second-hand glass. So they've got yichus. One day, Mr. Limantani gets a phone call from somebody who says that he is the secretary of the Pope and the Pope would like him to come and visit. My friend Limantani has a couple of prankster friends who make jokes. And 3 days later, he meets his buddy, and he says to him, Chaim, it's not funny to tell me that you're impersonating the Pope's secretary. And he says to him, I didn't call you. So my friend Limantani gets in touch with the Pope's secretary, and they go to visit the Pope. And John Paul says to him, we've done some research, and we know that you're a childhood friend of Rabbi Toaf, that you live in the same building, you pray in the synagogue, and I want you to do me a favor. I've decided that I want to visit the synagogue, but I don't want to put the chief rabbi in a situation where he has no choice but to say yes. If I call him or write him a letter, I'm going to say to the Pope, don't come. So I want you to do me a favor. I want you to ask him whether, in fact, he's ready for me to come. All right, he carried a message, and Rabbi Toaf sent a message back. He needs 10 days because it's not only his decision, and he has to poll the chief rabbis of Europe, which he did. The answer was yes, and John Paul came to visit. But that visit was the most significant change in dogma. Here comes the Pope, b'chvodo ba'atzmo, and he goes and he sits in the synagogue, and he basically says to the Christian world, Judaism has viability, it was of then, of today, and in the future. And then, the joke was he couldn't pass the synagogue he didn't go into. But then he said all the other things. He said anti-Semitism is a sin. He said, elder brother, all the right things he said. Okay, then comes Pope Benedict. And we Jews worry. What was our worry? That what John Paul had put in there was episodic, was not institutional. That the church will say, okay, you know what, a Polish pope, he lived through the Shoah, maybe had a Jewish girlfriend, as some people wrote. Okay, and so let's move on. And we were worried that there may come, as everybody predicted, an African or a Hispanic pope who would focus on other issues, and we're finished with that history. Gott helft, we got a German pope. Not just any German cardinal, but Ratzinger, who was the keeper of the faith, which means nothing that John Paul did, he did without the acquiescence of Ratzinger, who was the defender of the faith. What does Ratzinger do? What does Benedict do? He goes to shul. So he continues the tradition, and he institutionalizes what John Paul placed, therefore not being episodic, but no. But okay, so he retires, and we worry again. And this time comes a pope who is Latino Hispanic, but there is hashgacha. Here is a pope who goes to synagogue on slichus. Okay? When most Jews don't know what slichus is, haven't been to synagogue, period, he goes to synagogue in Buenos Aires on slichus night. Slichus night is the Saturday night before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's the beginning of the service of forgiveness, okay? So it starts like 10, 11 o'clock at night. This cardinal, this pope, went to slichus, to synagogue. Now, and when I write my book of things I should have done, the ADL published all the speeches and writings of John Paul. It's a big book called The Saint of Shalom. So I get a call one day from the rabbi in Buenos Aires, and he says to me, Mr. Foxman, I saw you published this wonderful book of all the writings of John Paul. I've just written the book with the Cardinal of Buenos Aires. Why don't you consider publishing in English our exchange of letters? So in a very nice way, I say, Wasserlachtan, every rabbi who has an exchange of letters with some Catholic cleric we're going to publish. I should have published. All right, so he's continuing in the tradition. It's part of the church tradition. Israel is still an issue, by the way. I think on the issue of the records relating to the Shoah, I think he will open them. I think he will not move quickly on beatification of Pius. So that issue is fine. On the issue of Israel, there are issues. Because on one hand, it's a spiritual state, on the other hand, it's a political state. It has a lot of concerns about the safety, security, and well-being of Christians in Muslim lands. And it does play as to how far they go on the Israeli issue. They will be signing another agreement between the State of Israel and the Vatican in a couple of months. But I think most of us will be somewhat disappointed on his visit to Israel, because it's going to go very brief. It's going to go to Bethlehem, Amman, and Jerusalem. And that's part of the reality, the political reality, and if you will, the insurance concerns about the Muslim populations and the Christian populations in the Muslim world. But on the whole, it's good news.
Do you have any ideas as to how Israel can stop being so dependent on the U.S.?
In a strange way, I think if it makes peace, it'll be less dependent. There are all kinds of good things, but I just don't want you to see it as it's still so disproportionate that it's troubling, and I'll tell you how troubling. This year was 40 years anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. Israel and some countries have rules that after a certain period of time, the secret communications documents surface. And so there's been a debate in the last 40 years about the Yom Kippur War. Did the Israelis know? Didn't they know? If they did should they have acted preemptively, etc.? We know in 67, that the Israelis knew what was building and preempted. Okay? And so the question arose, well, was it a fashla? Was it a screw up in terms of intelligence, Israeli intelligence? And what surfaced was diaries or conversations with Golda Meir, which sort of answered this question, did Israel screw it up or not? And what became clear was that the United States said to Israel, do not preempt. Okay? Do not preempt Egypt. And Israel didn't preempt. And that's what makes that nightmare even worse. So here is your one friend. Here you know an attack is coming. You know you could prevent lives, save lives, etc. And yet when your ally said, why? Because the threat was that America will not resupply Israel with the arms that it uses the next day, which we'll need for deterrence or whatever. I remember conversation a couple of years ago. I don't remember the name of the prime minister. This was between Berlusconi 1 and Berlusconi 2. There was a socialist prime minister, or socialist, whatever, left of center prime minister in Italy. Italy has a major trade, or had, with Iran. It still has. It's one of the major trading partners with Iran. And the Italians, this was again a debate about nuclear proliferation and Iran becoming nuclear power. And the Italians came up with a formula. And part of selling their formula was to try to sell it to the Jews as well, because we have some impact on Congress, etc. So we had a meeting in Rome with the prime minister, the foreign minister, and the prime minister says to us, here's my situation, and here's what we'll do. And I looked at him and I said, Mr. Prime Minister, and what if the Iranians cheat? Which means they'll have a nuclear weapon. He said to me, Mr. Foxman, we will be there. So I had a chutzpah, I was a little younger, so I said to him, yeah, like you were in 67 and 73, and more recently in the Gaza war. And he had no answer. But you should know that in 67, when the Americans resupplied Israel, and in 73, when the Americans resupplied Israel, and in the Gaza war and in the Lebanon war, when they resupplied Israel, none of the European countries would permit American planes to refuel, whether in the Azores, in Portugal, or anywhere else, which meant that American planes flew half empty because it couldn't refuel. So when we're looking for alternatives to the U.S., look, Israel's always trying to lower its dependence, always trying to reach out. Lieberman is trying Africa, but Africa needs help. Africa can't give help. And even in Europe with trade, the good part is Europe needs to trade as much as Israel needs to trade. But I don't see a substitute I don't see a substitute. I've been quoted this week somewhere as to say that anti-Semitism in the world is the worst that it's been since World War II. But it's not like it was in World War II. What even Limmud says, the vibrancy of the community of our people. The world has changed dramatically for the better. There is today a Jewish state of Israel. There is today still an America that I single out, as terrible as it is, that's the only one. It's still the only country out there that says Israel has a right to defend itself. Still the only country that will vote in the Senate 99 to garnish, and the only reason it's not 100 is somebody sitting in a hospital, that Israel has a right to defend itself and will be there. So you have today what we did not have then. You have a sovereign, independent Jewish state where a Jew in Venezuela or in Argentina or a Chveisvu doesn't have to worry whether he can find a cousin or a bureaucrat or epis, period. You have a United States which, again, with its legislation, with its voice, etc., stands. And you have an American Jewish community which we didn't have. An American Jewish community not only wants to learn and understand, but if you want to understand why there is the belief in the world out there that we are all powerful, come September with the UN, I have a dance card you can't believe. I run from one prime minister to another prime minister to another foreign minister, not because I've got a smile, because they believe that we're powerful. Why do they believe that we're powerful? For good reason. Take yourself back to the Soviet Jewry struggle. There was a Cold War and a hot war between the Soviet Union. The determination of the level of relationship between these two great powers were determined by what? How the Soviet Union treats its Jews. Jackson Vanik, 2 Jewish congressmen and senators from Jewish constituencies. America, with the help of the Jewish community, determined whether Yurok was bringing the Kirov ballet or whether we were selling them wheat. It determined now they're not completely, wrong when they say there's something going on here. If the Jewish community on one of its issues can so move this country, so that's changed. It brought about freedom for Soviet Jewry, Syrian Jewry, Ethiopian Jewry. And after the first visit of Glasnost and Perestroika, I went to Moscow and I met with Cyril II, the #1 Christian, Russian Orthodox. And he said to me, "You worked for freedom, religious freedom for Jews. Why didn't you work for religious freedom for us?" And I looked at him and I said, "You know how many Christians there are in the free world? You know how many Jews there are? Where were you?" But that's the message that's not been forgotten. And that message of that triumvirate, Trinity, if you're comfortable, of Israel, America, still, and the American Jewish community is that which will protect us on all the issues that you've asked about. Thank you. Be well.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.